All right. Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to dive in.
Great. Well, today we're looking at something pretty interesting. We're going beyond those usual headlines, to explore the UK's role in the whole Russia-Ukraine war.
Okay, yeah.
And the jumping off point for this whole thing is an opinion piece. It's from the American Conservative.
Interesting.
Yeah, the title's a real grabber. Why is the UK so invested in the Russia-Ukraine war? And it basically puts forward this idea that the UK, they might be driven by historical baggage, and a kind of moral mission thing more than even the Biden administration.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we're going to unpack some pretty thought-provoking stuff today. We'll look at the impact of the 2024 U.S. election on the conflict, this whole idea of a Munich reflex, and even whether peace itself is kind of being overlooked as the ultimate goal.
Sounds like a lot to cover.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So what are your initial thoughts on this angle? Does it resonate at all with you?
Well, I mean, right off the bat, it's really interesting that the article links Trump's 2024 victory, like a hypothetical victory, to a potential shift towards a peace policy in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it suggests that a win for him could, embolden those who are advocating for a negotiated settlement and potentially even lead to a ceasefire.
Wow. Okay, so walk me through this a little. What are the article's reasoning there?
Well, it argues that the Biden administration, with their focus on unwavering support for Ukraine, may have maybe inadvertently, hindered the possibility of any serious peace talks.
Okay, so that's a bold claim, isn't it? It really makes you think about the different approaches to international relations and how they play out.
Definitely does.
Yeah. All right. So before we really delve into the what a Trump presidency could mean for this whole conflict, the article, it argues that the war itself, at its root, stems from a catastrophic failure of diplomacy. So can you kind of unpack that for us? What went wrong?
Sure. So the article, it criticizes both Russia and the West for failing to really, bridge that gap in understanding. And this is particularly regarding NATO expansion.
Right.
So it argues that there's this fundamental clash of narratives, right? The West views NATO as a purely defensive alliance, whereas others see it as a kind of a tool for Western expansionism.
Yeah.
And according to the article, this difference in perspective, it basically made any genuine dialogue nearly impossible.
Yeah. It's almost like that anecdote about Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin, where she asks for guarantees that Putin won't go for any more border changes.
Yeah, right.
And then Putin, he turns around and asks for guarantees against further NATO expansion. It highlights that deep mistrust, doesn't it?
Exactly. And it really speaks to that key point the article makes, that this, lack of trust, it's fueled by all these different interpretations of history and intentions. And that played a huge role in the whole breakdown of diplomacy.
Fascinating stuff. Now, the article also goes into some really interesting historical context, specifically for Britain's involvement.
Okay.
It argues that Britain's stance, it's deeply rooted in this historical role they've played as a global policeman and mentor, kind of a, legacy that's shaping their foreign policy even today. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the article, it brings up Lord Granville's statement back in 1852.
Oh, okay.
Where he talks about, Britain's duty to encourage progress globally. And it is really fascinating to see how that sense of responsibility mixed with a belief in the universality of British values has contributed to their kind of interventionist approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, and we see echoes of this too, in Tony Blair's speech from 1999, where he talks about spreading British values as key to global security. But the article doesn't stop there.
No?
No. It goes on to discuss the Munich reflex, and I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with that concept. Could you shed some light on it for our listeners?
Sure. So the Munich reflex, it refers to this kind of deep sense of guilt and responsibility the British establishment felt after the appeasement of Hitler back in 1938. It's the idea that giving in to dictators only emboldens them.
So is the article saying that the UK is looking at Putin through this lens of history, seeing him as another Hitler-type figure who has to be stopped no matter what?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possible interpretation. The article, it uses the Suez crisis as an example.
Right.
So when the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the UK immediately saw it as another Hitler-esque act of aggression.
Wow.
So this fear of repeating the mistakes of the past, of not standing up to a dictator, it's really ingrained in British foreign policy thinking.
That's a really insightful connection. It helps explain like why the UK has taken such a strong stance against Russia. But the article goes even deeper than that, right? It starts to explore this tension between moral idealism and realpolitik.
Okay.
It critiques that kind of simplistic view that democracies are like inherently peaceful while autocracies are inherently warlike. So where do you stand on that?
Well, the article quotes A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, who argued that, idealists, they often end up fighting these devastating war for seemingly just causes, while pragmatists, even those in autocratic systems, well, they prioritize peace because they needed to maintain stability.
Right.
And it's a nuanced perspective that really challenges that conventional wisdom.
It really does. And it makes you think about, the potential downsides of like approaching foreign policy with a purely moral lens.
Yeah.
The article even suggests that the West's promises of unconditional support to Ukraine might have, unintentionally made the war last longer. How could that be?
Well, it argues that by promising this unwavering support and maybe even fueling unrealistic expectations of total victory, the West might have disincentivized Ukraine from seriously considering, negotiations earlier in the conflict, And it's a controversial point, sure, but I think it's one worth pondering.
Absolutely. It definitely challenges us to look beyond those black and white narratives.
For sure.
Yeah, and it leaves us with this question, could the UK's, moral mission, could that actually be making it harder to find a way to peace? That's a question we need to explore further.
Definitely. It's interesting. You know how the article frames Trump's approach to foreign policy? It acknowledges that, there's this criticism that his style's transactional. Like it lacks that moral high ground, right?
Right.
But it argues that both his supporters and his critics, they miss a really crucial point.
Oh, okay. And what's that?
That seeking peace, like actually trying to achieve peace, is a moral objective in and of itself. So the article suggests that Trump's focus on getting to peace, even if it means kind of setting aside certain moral considerations, that might be exactly what's needed to end this whole thing.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of Pope Francis and his calls for peace negotiations. It's not about saying what happened was okay, but it's about recognizing the inherent value of peace, right, as the ultimate goal.
Exactly.
But how would a more transactional approach actually play out? What would that even look like on the ground?
Well, the article suggests that Trump's willingness to just engage directly, with Russia without any preconditions, that could be a real game changer. It contrasts this with what it sees as the current Western approach, which it argues is, too focused on punishing Russia and maybe missing those opportunities for real meaningful dialogue.
So the article's saying that holding on to a purely idealistic approach, that could actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, it's arguing that realpolitik, even though it might not be, as morally satisfying, might be more effective in actually achieving a tangible peace.
I see.
Think of it this way. Sometimes to do the most good, you have to be willing to work with people that you don't agree with.
That's a really thought-provoking point. But is the article saying that the UK, with its focus on this moral mission, is incapable of that kind of pragmatism?
Well, it kind of implies that the UK's commitment to this moral mission, it's admirable, of course.
Yeah.
But it might be blinding them to the potential benefits of a negotiated settlement. And it goes even further, actually. It suggests that the UK might have unintentionally, made the war last longer.
Oh, wow. How so?
Well, by encouraging Ukraine to believe in the possibility of total victory, a victory that might not be attainable without, a massive escalation of Western involvement. And as we've seen, neither the U.S. nor the U.K. really seems willing to risk that level of escalation.
So are we saying that the U.K.'s unwavering support, their refusal to even consider the possibility of a negotiated peace, that's actually done more harm than good?
I wouldn't say it's about assigning blame. It's more about, recognizing how complicated this whole situation is. What's important here is that the article's challenging us to think about whether the UK's stance, even though it comes from, good intentions, might be ignoring the realities on the ground, the human cost of this conflict and the potential for a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. It really feels like this article is pushing us to rethink everything we thought we knew about this whole conflict.
Mm.
Is it really as simple as like good versus evil, democracy versus autocracy?
Yeah, you've hit on something important there. The article, it challenges that whole simplistic, like, good versus evil way of thinking. It argues that history, it shows us a much more complicated reality. Like, take Bismarck, for example.
Okay.
He was leading an autocratic regime, right? But he only went to war with limited objectives. He wanted to achieve those goals with as little bloodshed as possible.
That's a really interesting contrast, especially with how the article portrays the West's current involvement in Ukraine.
Exactly, yeah. The article, it contrasts Bismarck's pragmatism with the devastating wars, that some idealistic leaders waged in the 20th century. These wars fought for, these grand, often impossible goals, and they just resulted in so much loss of life. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That good intentions don't always equal good outcomes.
It really is. So is the article saying that the West's, unwavering support for Ukraine, even though it comes from a good place, from a place of wanting to help, could actually lead to more suffering in the long run?
The article, it doesn't shy away from that question, even though it's a really uncomfortable one to ask. It argues that a negotiated settlement, even if it doesn't give Ukraine everything they want, might be the most realistic way to stop the fighting and to prevent things from escalating further.
That's a really hard thing to wrap your head around, especially with, all the horrible things that have happened. But I see how the article is kind of forcing us to think beyond just a purely moral framework, right? To think about the real world consequences of our actions.
Exactly. That's the core of what the article is trying to say. It's urging us to remember that peace, just peace in itself, that's a moral imperative. It shouldn't be seen as like a compromise of our values, but as the ultimate goal, even if getting there means making really hard choices.
Well, this deep dive is definitely given us all a lot to think about. The idea that the UK's moral mission in Ukraine, as well-intentioned as it might be, could be, unintentionally dragging the conflict out longer and actually making it harder to reach peace. That's a really tough pill to swallow, but it's something we have to think about.
It is, absolutely. This whole deep dive, it's shown us how complex this whole situation is.
Yeah.
And how we really need a much more nuanced understanding of the UK's role in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, we encourage you, keep digging into this, explore those different viewpoints, and come to your own informed opinions. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and keep asking those tough questions.